Douglas, a suburban town in County Cork, Ireland, known for its rolling green hills, cozy pubs, and the salty air from the Atlantic. It was here, in May of 1976, that Cillian Murphy's story began. Born into a middle-class family, Cillian wasn't surrounded by fame or fortune. His father worked in education, while his mother taught at a local school. This was a household of learning. Books lined the shelves, ideas were freely shared at the dinner table, and discipline was quietly instilled. From the beginning, Cillian's life was steeped in literature. The written word fascinated him. Stories had a way of transporting him beyond the walls of Cork into new worlds, strange minds, and endless possibilities. But there was something else, something that stirred deep inside him: music. The young Murphy grew up in the middle of Ireland's shifting cultural scene. Rock and roll, punk, and traditional Irish folk melodies blended in the streets. Soon enough, a guitar found its way into his hands. He and his brother Padraig would jam for hours, writing songs, experimenting with sounds. Music wasn't just a hobby, it was passion, rebellion, escape. For a time, it seemed like music might become his destiny. But destiny, as we'll see, had other plans. Alongside this creative spark, Cillian was deeply shaped by his Catholic schooling. Like so many Irish children of his generation, he attended rigorous Catholic institutions where faith, structure, and tradition dominated. The nuns and priests instilled order, but also left behind questions about authority, freedom, and identity that would later fuel the intensity he brought to the screen. It was here that his love for storytelling began to take real form. School plays, literature lessons, and theater trips opened his imagination further. For the first time, young Murphy discovered something powerful. When he stood on stage, people listened. His words, his expressions, his presence could move others. It wasn't fame he craved, but the magic of transformation. Still, acting was only a whisper of a possibility. To him, music seemed louder, more urgent. And so, Cillian Murphy's early years were a dance between worlds. On one side, the academic household of discipline and learning. On the other, the pull of creativity through music, theater, and literature. This tension, the practical versus the artistic, would follow him into adulthood, shaping every career decision he made. But what truly defined his childhood wasn't just the influences around him. It was the quiet intensity he carried within. Even as a boy, Cillian wasn't loud or brash. He wasn't trying to command attention. Instead, he observed. He absorbed. He studied people, details, emotions. Later, critics would call this his secret weapon. A gaze that could burn through the screen. A silence that spoke louder than words. But it all began here, in Cork, in the stillness of a boy watching the world with unflinching eyes. His parents may not have realized it then, but they were quietly raising an artist. A boy whose foundation of education, faith, and creativity would later allow him to break boundaries and embody characters far beyond his own life experience. And so, the stage was quietly being set. From Cork's classrooms to the music-filled bedrooms, from Catholic rituals to quiet moments with books, every piece of Cillian's childhood was preparing him for a destiny he hadn't yet considered. A destiny that would soon collide with theater and eventually Hollywood. But before the world knew him as Thomas Shelby in Peaky Blinders, before Christopher Nolan cast him in Batman Begins and Oppenheimer, Cillian Murphy was just a boy in Cork, torn between the life of a musician and the pull of the stage. Which path would he choose? Stay tuned, because in the next chapter, we'll uncover the pivotal moment that set Cillian Murphy on his path to becoming one of the most magnetic actors of his generation. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with a friend who loves great cinema. The story of Cillian Murphy is just getting started. Before Cillian Murphy became the haunting face of Oppenheimer or the razor-sharp leader of the Peaky Blinders, his heart was beating to a very different rhythm, the rhythm of music. Long before the stage lights of Hollywood, there was the dim glow of pubs in Cork, Ireland, and the electric pulse of a young man chasing a dream with a guitar in his hand. As a teenager, Murphy wasn't thinking of scripts or cameras. He was consumed by sound, riffs, melodies, lyrics. His passion for music was raw and relentless. He didn't just like music, he lived inside it. Friends remember him carrying a guitar everywhere, scribbling down lyrics and losing himself in records by artists who pushed boundaries: Frank Zappa, the Beatles, and Radiohead. Together with his brother Piety, he formed a band, the Sons of Mr. Green Jeans. The name itself, a quirky nod to a Frank Zappa track, tells you everything about their boldness. They weren't interested in playing it safe. Their sound was experimental, a little offbeat, but undeniably alive. Imagine a group of ambitious teenagers, rehearsing in cramped garages, dreaming about gigs that might one day take them beyond Cork. In those days, music was more than just a pastime. It was an identity, a rebellion, a way of carving out a place in the world. And Murphy fit the part perfectly: sharp cheekbones, intense stare, and that quiet, enigmatic presence. On stage, he was magnetic, though in a completely different way than the characters we know him for today. The band was good enough that record labels began to take notice. In fact, the Sons of Mr. Green Jeans were even offered a record deal. Think about that. Cillian Murphy's life could have gone in an entirely different direction. The world might never have seen him as Thomas Shelby. Instead, we might have known him as a rock musician, headlining festivals, touring across Europe, and filling arenas. But here's the twist. That dream was never fully realized. The record deal came with strings attached, clauses that would have tied the band down, contracts that felt suffocating. Murphy, even then, had a strong sense of integrity. He wasn't willing to give away his creative freedom, not for a taste of fame. Looking back, it's almost poetic. Music was the stage where Cillian learned about discipline, collaboration, and the raw thrill of performing. But it was also where he realized something vital, that his true voice wasn't found in a song, but in a story. So, slowly but surely, Murphy began to drift. Music remained a love, but acting began to whisper to him, quietly at first, and then louder. He started to experiment with theater, stepping into characters the way he once stepped into melodies. And there, on stage, he felt something shift, an intensity, a clarity, a calling. Imagine it: one decision, one fork in the road. On one side, the chaos of rock and roll, touring, fame, and music. On the other, the uncertain world of acting, small plays, auditions, long nights of rehearsals. Most people might have clung to the record deal. But Murphy chose differently. He chose the stage, the script, the performance that went beyond chords and choruses. It wasn't that he lost his passion for music. In fact, to this day, Cillian still plays, still listens obsessively, still credits music as his first love. But he understood something many artists never do. Sometimes, stepping away isn't giving up. Sometimes, it's stepping into who you were always meant to be. By the late 1990s, Murphy was no longer just the boy with a guitar in Cork. He was becoming something else entirely: a storyteller, a shapeshifter, an actor whose intensity would soon captivate directors across the world. And here's where I turn the question over to you, the audience. If you were in Cillian's shoes, would you have taken the record deal? Chased the music dream? Or would you have gambled everything on a shot at acting? Let me know in the comments below, because these are the decisions that shape destinies. In the end, we know the choice Cillian made. And looking at his career today, from cult classics to Academy Award-winning performances, it's hard not to wonder, did the world gain a great actor only because it lost a musician? Murphy's story reminds us that the paths we don't take are just as important as the ones we do. The songs he never recorded made way for the characters he brought to life. And in choosing acting over music, he gave us something unforgettable. Cillian Murphy didn't set out to become one of the most recognizable actors of his generation. In fact, when he first enrolled at University College Cork, the path he had chosen couldn't have been further from the stage. He was studying law, a career considered stable, respectable, and, to many, the right thing to do. But for Cillian, the heavy law books, dense legal theory, and hours spent in lecture halls felt like chains, pulling him away from something his spirit quietly craved. Though intelligent and capable, he found no joy in statutes or legal precedent. Law, he would later confess, was never his true calling. Yet, as fate often does, life had other plans. It was during these formative years at university that Cillian stumbled into a world that would change everything: the theater. In the heart of Cork stood the Corcadorca Theatre Company, a bold and fearless local troupe that wasn't afraid to take risks. They brought experimental, raw, and often gritty productions to life. For a young man searching for purpose, their stage was a revelation. Cillian found himself drawn to their energy, their willingness to strip stories bare, their ability to transform an ordinary room into a world filled with magic and truth. And when he stepped into this world, something within him awakened. His first forays into acting weren't glamorous. They weren't even guaranteed to succeed. But there, on that stage, Cillian discovered something that law never gave him: freedom. Freedom to express, to experiment, to embody characters who lived and breathed beyond the lines of a textbook. The audience could feel it too. Even in his earliest roles, there was something magnetic about him. His presence commanded attention. He wasn't simply acting, he was becoming. And though still unpolished, still raw, this was the beginning of a transformation. The contrast between his law studies and his nights in the theater couldn't have been starker. In class, he was restless, uninspired. On stage, he was alive. And slowly, the decision became clear: law was not his destiny. Art was. Corcadorca became his training ground. Each performance taught him discipline, vulnerability, and the power of connecting with an audience. There were no safety nets, no second takes, only the immediacy of live theater. And in those fragile, electric moments, Cillian realized that this was more than a hobby. It was a calling. Imagine being a young man, standing just off stage, heartbeat racing, palms sweating, knowing that in seconds the spotlight will find you. For Cillian, those moments weren't paralyzing, they were intoxicating. The nerves sharpened his focus, the adrenaline heightened his performance. Every line, every gesture, became a chance to peel back another layer of himself. It was a turning point, one of those subtle but seismic shifts in life. Many young students wander away from their studies, but for Cillian, this was different. He wasn't simply rejecting law, he was embracing something far more profound. He abandoned the path of a lawyer and chose the uncertain, unpredictable road of an artist. And with that decision came the first defining act of courage in his journey. Stage by stage, role by role, his talent became undeniable. Cork had discovered one of its brightest stars, though few at the time could have predicted how far he would go. But what set him apart wasn't just his talent. It was his willingness to dive deep, to lose himself in characters, to make his performances truthful. Even in those humble beginnings, Cillian showed the same commitment that would later define his career: a refusal to settle for anything less than authentic. Every great journey begins with a choice. For Cillian Murphy, that choice was made in Cork, in the dim glow of stage lights, when he realized he could no longer deny who he was meant to be. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a man bound to desks and paperwork. He was an actor, a storyteller, an artist. And from the stages of Corcadorca, a star was born. It was here, in those first stage roles, that the world caught its first glimpse of Cillian Murphy, the man who would go on to captivate audiences across the globe. By the late 1990s, Cillian Murphy was hungry. Hungry for stories, hungry for characters, hungry for a stage where he could pour out all the emotions that seemed to sit just beneath his skin. And in 2001, that hunger finally found its outlet in a small, gritty, and utterly unforgettable Irish film, Disco Pigs. Originally a play written by Enda Walsh, Disco Pigs was raw, jagged, and unpolished, a story about two young misfits, Pig and Runt, trapped in their own violent little world. Murphy had already played the role on stage to rave reviews. But the film version would change everything. This wasn't a movie that played it safe. It was daring, disturbing, and magnetic. And right in the middle of it all was a 24-year-old Cillian Murphy, electric, vulnerable, and impossible to look away from. What struck audiences most was his intensity. Cillian didn't just play Pig, he became him. Every glance, every twitch of the eye, every outburst felt painfully real. For a young Irish actor with no Hollywood connections and no blockbuster behind him, this was a breakthrough. The world outside Ireland began to take notice. Critics were astonished. They wrote about his raw energy, his dangerous vulnerability, his emotional ferocity. This wasn't just another indie actor chasing fame. This was someone who seemed born for cinema. Indie films became Cillian's training ground. Without the glossy polish of Hollywood, he had the freedom to experiment, to take risks. And it was in these stripped-down, low-budget stories that directors began to notice something rare. Cillian Murphy had the kind of presence that couldn't be taught. Those eyes, sharp, otherworldly, often described as almost inhuman, carried emotions that words couldn't. Sadness, fury, obsession, tenderness. In indie cinema, where character is everything, those eyes became his weapon. It wasn't just audiences who noticed. Directors, too, began to realize the depth he could bring to even the smallest role. They saw an actor who didn't act for applause, but for truth. An actor who gave everything, even if the world wasn't watching. After Disco Pigs, offers started trickling in. He took on projects like On the Edge and Intermission, continuing to prove that he could bring a haunting intensity to any role. Bit by bit, the quiet Irishman was carving a reputation in indie cinema, a master of emotional truth. And here's the thing about indie films, they're often the hidden gems that shape a career. They might not make millions at the box office, but they give actors space to grow. For Cillian, they became the forge where his craft was sharpened. Directors began to whisper about him. Producers took note. Casting agents scribbled his name in their notebooks. Because once you'd seen a performance like Disco Pigs, you didn't forget it. But what's most fascinating is that Murphy himself never chased the spotlight. While others dreamed of Hollywood blockbusters, he kept choosing projects with soul, even if they were small, even if they barely reached theaters outside Ireland. Why? Because for him, it wasn't about fame. It was about honesty. About disappearing into a role so deeply that audiences forgot they were watching a performance at all. And that right there is the paradox of Cillian Murphy. The quieter he kept his personal life, the louder his presence rang on screen. The more modest he was in interviews, the more magnetic he became in films. It's this tension between the shy artist and the fearless performer that made directors certain this was no ordinary actor. By the early 2000s, Cillian Murphy was no longer just a local talent. He was a force. Indie cinema had given him his first canvas. And on it, he painted characters so vivid, so uncomfortably real, that audiences couldn't look away. That's when the calls started coming. Bigger directors. Bigger projects. Bigger risks. Every legend has a starting point. For Cillian Murphy, it was indie cinema, where intensity met opportunity, and where a young actor with haunting blue eyes convinced the world that he was something extraordinary. If you're loving this story so far, subscribe for the next chapter, where Cillian Murphy steps onto the world stage in a way no one saw coming. Picture this. London. But not the London we know. No rush hour, no chatter, no cars. Just silence. Streets empty, as if the entire city had vanished overnight. And in the middle of it all, one man, wandering in confusion, barefoot in a hospital gown. That haunting image? It wasn't just the start of Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later. It was also the beginning of Cillian Murphy's global breakout. Released in 2002, 28 Days Later wasn't just another horror film. It was the film that redefined the zombie genre, injecting speed, rage, and relentless terror into creatures once thought slow and predictable. But beyond that, it was the film that catapulted a young Irish actor, Cillian Murphy, onto the international stage. Danny Boyle, already celebrated for Trainspotting, was looking for someone who could carry a film with raw emotion, vulnerability, and grit. The role of Jim wasn't about muscle or heroics. It required something deeper. An everyman quality, someone the audience could root for as they too navigated a world gone mad. And Boyle found exactly that in Cillian Murphy. For Cillian, the casting was a gamble. Up until then, he was known mainly in Ireland and the UK. He'd been grinding in indie films, stage plays, and small productions. But suddenly, he was handed the lead in a major film by one of Britain's most daring directors. This was the role that would change everything. Murphy's performance as Jim was magnetic. At first, he's fragile, confused, weak, almost childlike as he stumbles through the devastation. But as the story unfolds, we watch him transform, driven by survival, rage, and the will to protect. It was more than horror. It was humanity laid bare. And critics noticed. Reviewers were quick to single out Murphy. They praised his ability to balance vulnerability with quiet strength, his piercing blue eyes communicating terror, hope, and determination all at once. Suddenly, audiences around the world were asking the same question. Who is this guy? 28 Days Later was a surprise smash. Made on a modest budget of just $8 million, it grossed over $85 million worldwide. More importantly, it sparked a cultural phenomenon, reviving interest in apocalyptic stories and paving the way for future hits like The Walking Dead and World War Z. And at the heart of it all was Cillian Murphy. For Cillian, the success was overwhelming. Overnight, he went from relative obscurity to international recognition. Yet, despite the sudden spotlight, he remained soft-spoken, grounded, almost reluctant about the fame. It wasn't stardom he was chasing, it was good stories, great collaborations, and meaningful roles. And this breakout gave him the ticket to pursue exactly that. Hollywood took notice. Suddenly, scripts were landing on his desk. Producers and directors who had never heard his name were now asking for him by choice. This one role opened the door to the Hollywood machine. And soon, it would place him alongside industry titans, working with the likes of Christopher Nolan, Wes Craven, and more. Think about it, without 28 Days Later, there may never have been Jonathan Crane, the chilling scarecrow of Nolan's Batman Begins. No Robert Fisher in Inception. And maybe no Thomas Shelby in Peaky Blinders. It was the spark that lit the fire. In 2005, a pale-faced man with piercing blue eyes stepped into Gotham City, not as the hero, not as the villain you might expect, but as something more unsettling. Cillian Murphy became Dr. Jonathan Crane, better known as the Scarecrow. This was Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, the rebirth of a franchise that had lost its way. While Christian Bale donned the cape and cowl, Murphy delivered a villain who was frightening not because of brute force, but because of psychology. His Crane was intelligent, soft-spoken, and terrifyingly calm until the mask went on and the madness came out. Unlike comic book villains who shout and rage, Murphy gave us a scarecrow who whispered. A villain who didn't need muscle, he had fear itself as his weapon. It was subtle, it was disturbing, and it worked. What most people don't know is that Murphy had originally auditioned, not for the Scarecrow, but for Batman himself. That's right. Christopher Nolan saw something in Murphy that went beyond just a supporting role. Though the cowl ultimately went to Christian Bale, Nolan was captivated by Murphy's screen test, the intensity in his eyes, the quiet menace he could summon with just a look. And so, Nolan found another role that would allow him to unleash that power. Batman Begins was a hit, breathing new life into the superhero genre. And while the headlines went to Bale's Batman, critics and audiences alike noticed Murphy. His performance as Scarecrow wasn't just a side note, it was a highlight. When Nolan returned for The Dark Knight in 2008, Scarecrow wasn't forgotten. In the opening act, Cillian Murphy reprised his role. Though it was just a brief appearance, it cemented something important. Scarecrow was part of Nolan's Gotham DNA. He wasn't a one-time villain. He was woven into the fabric of the trilogy. And then again, in The Dark Knight Rises 2012, Scarecrow returned. This time presiding over Gotham's kangaroo courts in the film's chilling post-apocalyptic setup. 3 films, 3 appearances. Cillian Murphy had become the only villain to span Nolan's entire Batman trilogy. But here's the real story. Batman wasn't just a gig. It was the beginning of one of modern cinema's most fascinating collaborations, Cillian Murphy and Christopher Nolan. What started with a burlap mask became a creative partnership that has lasted for decades. After Batman Begins, Nolan kept calling Murphy back. First, as the fragile-minded Robert Fisher in Inception, 2010, where Murphy played the emotional anchor in a film of dreams within dreams. Then in Dunkirk, 2017, as the shivering, shell-shocked soldier rescued from the sea, a role with minimal dialogue, but maximum emotional impact. And finally, in Oppenheimer, 2023, Nolan entrusted Murphy with the weight of the world itself, portraying J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. It's extraordinary when you think about it. The same actor who once terrified audiences with a burlap mask and hallucinogenic gas is now commanding the screen in one of the most serious, acclaimed historical dramas of our time. All under the same director. All through the trust of Christopher Nolan. Nolan has often said there's something in Cillian's eyes, that rare intensity, that stillness, that draws the camera in. Whether he's wearing a mask in Gotham or sitting silently on a boat in Dunkirk, you can't look away. Their collaboration has become one of the defining director-actor partnerships of the 21st century. Like Scorsese had De Niro, like Tarantino has DiCaprio, Nolan has Murphy. Not just as a recurring actor, but as a muse. And with Oppenheimer, Murphy finally took center stage, after nearly 2 decades of building trust and proving his range. And here's the kicker, fans love it. Every time Murphy appears in a Nolan film, it feels like a secret handshake. An Easter egg for the devoted, a reminder that some collaborations are more than business, they're creative destiny. From Gotham's villain to the world's most conflicted genius. Cillian Murphy's journey with Christopher Nolan is not just about roles. It's about evolution. It's about trust. It's about an actor and a director who see in each other the possibility of something greater than either could achieve alone. If you've loved watching Murphy's transformation from Scarecrow to Oppenheimer, imagine what comes next. This isn't the end of the Murphy-Nolan story, it's just the latest chapter. And if you want to keep following this journey with us, hit subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves cinema as much as you do. Every generation has a role, a character, that defines it. For Al Pacino, it was Michael Corleone. For Bryan Cranston, Walter White. And for Cillian Murphy? It was Thomas Shelby, the man in the flat cap who turned a local Birmingham gangster into a global phenomenon. In 2013, the BBC took a gamble, a period crime drama set in post-World War I Birmingham. It wasn't meant to be a global hit. But from the very first episode, audiences knew this was something different. And at the heart of it all was Cillian Murphy. Cillian wasn't the obvious choice. In fact, the show's creator, Stephen Knight, originally wanted someone taller, rougher, with the look of a street fighter. But when Murphy stepped into the room, something changed. His piercing blue eyes, his quiet intensity, his ability to command a room with a whisper. Suddenly, Thomas Shelby wasn't just a character. He was alive. For years, Murphy had been known as the indie darling. The actor who took on unusual, challenging roles. But with Peaky Blinders, he became something else entirely, a household name. Young fans who had never seen his earlier work now knew him as the man who controlled Birmingham with nothing but his mind, his cigarette, and his razor-sharp words. It wasn't just acting. It was alchemy. Murphy made Shelby both terrifying and tender. A war hero scarred by trauma. A criminal mastermind building an empire. A lover, a father, a man haunted by ghosts. This complexity is what made the character unforgettable. And soon, Thomas Shelby wasn't just a character on TV, he became a global icon. Fashion shifted. The flat cap came back. Barbershops offered the Shelby cut. Lines from the show turned into memes, quotes, and tattoos. Murphy's performance had created not just a role, but a cultural wave. But here's the thing, Cillian Murphy never asked for fame. He never set out to be a style icon. And yet, Thomas Shelby changed everything. Overnight, Murphy went from respected actor to legendary figure. Young men across the world began mimicking his quiet coolness. Shelby's calm, deliberate tone became the template for confidence and control. Think about it. How many actors can define masculinity for an entire generation without shouting, without over-the-top gestures, but simply through presence? Cillian Murphy did that. He became the symbol of power, of resilience, of survival, and of style. From Birmingham to Brooklyn, from Cork to Tokyo, Peaky Blinders wasn't just a TV series. It was a movement. And at the center of it all, quietly carrying the weight of global adoration, was Cillian Murphy. And yet, the man behind Thomas Shelby never lost himself. While Hollywood called, while fashion magazines crowned him a style god, Cillian chose to stay grounded. He returned often to his home in Cork, Ireland, where he lives with his wife, artist Yvonne McGuinness, and their children. For him, the applause of fans was fleeting, but the laughter of his family was eternal. Unlike Thomas Shelby, who thrived on power and control, Cillian Murphy craved something simpler, a life outside the spotlight. He once said, "If you lose your anonymity, it's gone forever." That's why he avoids the Hollywood lifestyle, preferring quiet dinners at home over red carpets and champagne parties. In 2023, Cillian Murphy stepped into a role that would define his career. A role so monumental, so heavy with history, that it demanded nothing less than complete transformation. He wasn't just playing a character. He was embodying one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And in doing so, Murphy didn't just act. He became. This wasn't just another project. This was Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's sprawling 2023 epic, filmed in IMAX, blending science, politics, and morality into a cinematic masterpiece. And at the center of it all stood Cillian Murphy, gaunt, magnetic, and utterly compelling. For years, Murphy had been one of Nolan's secret weapons. From the eerie scarecrow in Batman Begins to small but memorable appearances in Inception and Dunkirk. But now, after nearly 2 decades of collaboration, Nolan handed him the keys to the entire film. This wasn't a supporting role. This wasn't a cameo. This was the lead. The weight of carrying a Christopher Nolan epic rested squarely on Murphy's shoulders. And Nolan made no secret of it. In interviews, he confessed, "I knew if Cillian said yes, he would give everything." And he did. But taking on Oppenheimer was not easy. This wasn't a straightforward biopic. It wasn't a clean-cut tale of triumph. It was the story of a brilliant, conflicted man, the genius who unlocked the atom, and in doing so, unleashed destruction on a scale humanity had never known. To prepare, Murphy lost significant weight, shrinking his frame to match Oppenheimer's lean, almost fragile body. He devoured biographies. He studied Oppenheimer's letters, his voice, his mannerisms. He immersed himself not just in the science, but in the man's moral torment. Murphy later admitted in interviews, "It was the biggest challenge I've ever faced as an actor." And it showed. Every glance, every silence, every flicker of doubt in Murphy's eyes told the story of a man at war with himself. This wasn't just acting, it was inhabiting. When you watched Murphy on screen, you weren't seeing Cillian. You were seeing Oppenheimer, haunted, brilliant, and burdened with the knowledge that he had changed the world forever. When Oppenheimer premiered, audiences were stunned. The film was hailed as Nolan's masterpiece, an epic of science and morality. But time and time again, critics returned to one central point: Cillian Murphy's performance. The New York Times called him mesmerizing. Variety praised his magnetic intensity. And fans across the globe took to social media, declaring, "Give him the Oscar already." For an actor who had always been admired as underrated or a chameleon, Oppenheimer shattered those labels. Murphy was no longer the hidden gem. He was the star. And then came the awards season. Oppenheimer dominated the conversation. Best Picture, Best Director for Nolan, and of course, Best Actor for Cillian Murphy.